In Proverbs 4 and verse number 7, wisdom is the principal thing, therefore get wisdom, and with all thy getting, get understanding. I want to deal today with the Bible and science. The Bible and science. Science is knowledge. Sophia, we have is the Greek word for knowledge. And in the matter of science, the Bible is not a science book. It is not necessarily a book about science, but every aspect of science that is dealt with by the Bible is entirely and totally accurate. No small problem is confronted when an attempt is made to state scientific truths according to the understanding of one age that will be acceptable to every succeeding age. Science is ever shifting. Now, scientific fact and principle never changes. There was no anthropogenic global warming in the book of Genesis, and there is no anthropogenic global warming today. Scientific fact and truth, the law of gravity, the morning and the evening, and so on, the earth revolving, rotating on its axis and revolving around the sun, those things never change. But there is a change of understanding from one age to another age. And these things are reflected in the language and reflected in man's understanding. Science is ever shifting, and the subject is always subject to its own revisions, and these are not always complete. It reflects with a good degree of accuracy the progress from one generation to another generation of human knowledge and human understanding that we have. But in the field of science, no human author has ever been able to avoid the fate of obsolete observations of later periods. That's why a science book, like a mechanic's manual, from one generation to the next, some things become obsolete. My great-grandfather, Horace Seitler, was an automobile mechanic. He was a Packard automobile mechanic, and the reason that my granddad wound up in Greenville, South Carolina, and then started the Bright Spot Hour in Greenville, South Carolina, and started Tabernacle Baptist Church in Greenville, South Carolina, was because the Packard Motor Car Company moved my great-grandfather, my granddad's dad, from the Low Country or from the Midlands of Columbia. He worked at the Packard dealership in Columbia, and they moved him from Columbia to the upstate to Martin Bridges Packard in Greenville, South Carolina. That happened when my grandfather was about 12 years old. Now, as they say, the rest is history, but it was that providential movement by Packard Motor Car Company of my grandfather that brought my great-grandfather, that brought my grandfather to Greenville, South Carolina. Now, I have in my possession some of my great-grandfather's mechanics manuals that were produced by Packard Corporation, and they used there in the dealership working on Packard automobiles. The principles of the internal combustion engine and the principles of mechanics are the same in every generation. But there is nothing in any of these Packard manuals that my grandfather used that dealt with computers and electronic engine management systems and electronic fuel injection. Many of the cars that he was working on were still 6-volt systems, and now we have 12-volt systems, and even some large trucks with 24-volt systems. I enjoy thumbing through them, those mechanic manuals, and thinking that my grandfather handled these books and read them in his lifetime when he was the age that I am now. But much of that becomes obsolete. And so it is with science books and science manuals and doctors' journals. Much of that becomes obsolete over time. Now listen to me for just a moment. Yet the divine record that I have in the Bible, though the Bible is not a science book, the Bible is not a book about science, but the divine record that I read in the Bible has been so framed under divine inspiration that there is no conflict with what I read in the King James Bible and true science in this age or in any other age of human history. The Bible makes the declaration in Leviticus 17:11, for the life of the flesh is in the blood. If President Washington's doctors had read Leviticus 17:11 and believed it, perhaps they didn't have the capacity to comprehend the life of the flesh is in the blood. They would not have bled him trying to cure him of an illness. They were taking out of the president the very thing that he needed to sustain his life. They were making him anemic by bleeding him rather than leaving the blood in his body. Now, it would be impossible for human authors to write as the Bible is written about the matters of science. That here we have in the record of the Bible that has stood for centuries, material that is scientifically accurate. If man had written that, man would have messed it up. And man criticizes the Bible now. The Bible talks about the four corners of the earth, and they laugh at that and say, well, how can a sphere have four corners? And the Bible talks about the going down of the sun. And some scientists will say, well, that's ridiculous and foolish, because we all know the sun doesn't go up or down, but the earth rotates on its axis, and in the morning we see the sun rising in the east through the rotation of the earth, and it runs its course across the earth, and then it sets in the west, but it's not actually setting. The sun stays where it is, and it's the rotation of the earth. You're always going to have some jerk, some smart aleck that thinks he knows more than God and thinks he knows more than the Bible, that is going to question, and he's going to question what he reads in the Bible. But now wait a minute. As far as human vision is concerned, there is no inaccuracy when the Bible talks about the rising of the sun and the setting thereof. There is no scientific inaccuracy in that, because that is exactly what man sees. You see, the Bible is justified in the use of generally used terms, especially since no other terms have ever been proposed, and there is no better term that could be used in relation to what the Bible has given. So whenever we come to the Bible in science, you and I recognize that the Bible is accurate. Now, there is no other ancient book that is accurate in all the scientific details that it deals with. And yet when I open up the Bible, I have here an ancient book. I have an ancient holy book from the East. And I find in this holy book, the Bible, complete accuracy concerning the matters of science. Now, there are some other ancient books, and I have some of these in my library, and when I read in them about creation or the origin of the universe, there are some of these that my grandchildren would recognize as being fairy tales and legends. Even the Quran gives some very simplistic and ridiculous ideas concerning the creation of the earth. Now, you think about some ancient errors. Plato, for example, Plato wrote, using the language of probability, we may say that the world became a living soul and truly rational through the providence of God. And it was Plato that believed, and this is brought forward in some false cults in the world today, there are four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And he said out of such elements, which are in number four, the body of the world was created. With all due respect to Plato, he is entirely and totally wrong. And when I now compare what Plato said with science, I find that it is the most ridiculous thing. Aristotle said that, in fact, Will Durant says, before Aristotle, science was in embryo. With him, it was born. Now, what a ridiculous statement could be made about the man Aristotle. The Greeks and the Hindus, you know, the Greeks are always elevated as knowing philosophy, Greek philosophy. Oh, I'm smart because I have read Aristotle and Plato. Look, I started reading Aristotle and Plato when I was 16 years old. Now, don't talk to me about how smart you are because you read some in Plato and you've read some in Aristotle. I started reading Plato and Aristotle when I was 16 years old. I have never been convinced that they were right, and I have never elevated anything they wrote above the level of what I read in the King James Bible. We talk about the Greek philosophers. The ancient Greeks believed that a giant Atlas stood at the borders of the earth and upheld the wide heaven with tireless hidden arms. And the Hindus believed that the earth was supported on the backs of elephants. And these elephants stood, which stood on the shell, these elephants stood on the shell of a great turtle. And the great turtle swam around in a cosmic sea. Now, if you believe that, my friend, you're crippled too high for crutches. And yet we say, oh, the Greeks, we need to listen to the Greeks. It's like the state legislature in your state and in mine saying we need to listen to the experts. The experts can tell us what to do. Well, the experts like the Greeks and the Hindus are a little squared away from home. They're nuts. They're crazy. They're out of their minds. If you follow what they say, you will be in more trouble than you will ever get out of. The Egyptians had strange ideas about creation. The Babylonians had weird ideas about creation. But what I read in Genesis 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Verse 2, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. When I read that in Genesis 1:1, to this day, some 7,000 years later, that has never been contradicted. And Paul later came along and he said, in Hebrews, through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. Now that's the Bible and science. The Bible is not a book of science, but all the science the Bible deals with is always totally accurate.
Check out the website at thebrightspothour.com. Write Dr. Carper at Post Office Box 4, Greenville, South Carolina